This is Dublin Pond, a small body of water nestled within the mountains of southern New Hampshire. From above, it appears like an average, ordinary pond, and that's because these days, well, it's exactly that. But less than 100 years ago, this wasn't the case. Back then, it was called by a different name, Monadnock Lake, and it was well known throughout the area that every year a huge number of peculiar fish would rise from its depths and enter the shallows to breed. These were unlike any other fish found in surrounding lakes, besides maybe the brook trout, though they were only ever about a foot long, half the length of regular brook trout, and were considerably brighter, giving them a silvery green coloration that earned them the common name, the silver trout. Eventually, specimens of this silver trout were taken from this pond and sent to the U.S. National Museum, where, after some debate, they received the taxonomic description Salvelinus agassiae, solidifying its status as a species. For a time, Dublin Pond was the only known home of this species, until after years of searching, an almost identical fish was caught over 120 miles north in Christine Lake. Together, these two isolated lakes were the only proven habitats of Salvelinus agassiae. Naturally, this presented quite an enigma for many scholars at the time. How could this one fish have come to occupy such distant waters? Unfortunately, before this could be properly answered, the silver trout suddenly disappeared. The last one to be caught from Christine Lake was in 1926, and 4 years later in 1930, 6 were caught in Dublin Pond, marking the final confirmed sighting of this species. By 1939, the New Hampshire Fish and Game Department conducted an extensive survey of the entire Connecticut River watershed, including both Dublin Pond and Christine Lake, without finding a single silver trout, leading them to be presumed extinct. Since then, many have closed the book on the silver trout, but I still have some unanswered questions. How did this one small trout species find its way into two bodies of water over 100 miles apart? What caused them to vanish so soon after their discovery? And what was the ultimate fate of the silver trout? Are they truly gone forever, or could it still be lurking somewhere in the waters of New Hampshire? Sadly, interest in this fish seems to have faded in the century since it disappeared, making it difficult to get to the bottom of these mysteries in the modern day. But as we just learned, there are still 2 places where some memory of these fish might remain, which is why my friend Milo and I ventured out to these lakes to see what we could learn by searching for the extinct silver trout. Alright, so normally this would be where I tell you that before we get to the fun stuff, we first need to do a bunch of boring preliminary research and whatnot. But to be honest, that's not really what I did for this one. Knowing there were only 2 small lakes I needed to search, I kinda just dove headfirst into this. The first and final place the silver trout was seen is Dublin Pond, so it only makes sense to start my journey here. Plus, from where I live in New York, it's the closer of the 2 lakes at only a 4-hour drive away. Getting there, I found the only area that was quiet but still had public access was along the road on the north side of the pond, so that's where I started my search. As I set out, I really only had 2 goals in mind. First, to figure out the best method for sampling fish, and second, to make observations on the ecosystem within this pond. For this first goal, I started out by using the traditional method people once used to observe the silver trout, the classic fishing rod. 100 years ago, people would come to this lake with nothing but a hook and some line to snag themselves a fish, so this is what I tried to do. And here's my state of New Hampshire hunting and fishing license if any of you were curious. Though after filming a whole time lapse without getting even a nibble, I started to feel like this method wasn't going to be as effective as I'd hoped. Just to be sure it wasn't the location I was in, I hopped in my kayak and paddled out into the middle of the pond. Again, I filmed a whole time lapse without feeling a single bite, and even worse, I barely had any footage to show for it. Alright, here I am, Dublin Pond. Been fishing for a few hours now.
I haven't even seen a fish, but I've also been filming, so I haven't been fishing the entire time. So I hope you can't hear those people right over there, because if you can hear them, that means they can hear me. But so far, no fish. No fish, not even a bite. And there are other people fishing here. They haven't got bites either. So I don't know. That might be an unforeseen conclusion that I'm drawing. No fish here whatsoever.
Finally, I gave up on the idea of actually catching any fish and decided my best bet was to try to catch them on camera, so I started just dunking my GoPro as deep in the water as I could reach. None of the footage from this turned out particularly well either, but it did give me my first real glimpse into the Dublin pond ecosystem, and from what I could see, the lake bed appears rather empty. Eventually, I did manage to spot a couple fish using this method, but they were all too far away to properly identify. After seeing this, I figured I could probably get better footage simply by hopping in the water myself and filming by hand. I certainly got better shots of the Dublin pond ecosystem using this method, though what I saw really only confirmed what I'd glimpsed earlier, that this lake bed was mostly devoid of plants and animals. The only visible vegetation was to be found along the very edges of the pond, where thin stalks of what I believe are pipewort poked out of the water. These might have been cool to catch in bloom, but to be honest, seeing them here long after the fact didn't make this lake environment appear any more impressive. Below the surface, however, the pipewort did seem to form a somewhat complex space, one I can imagine fish might enjoy taking shelter within, so I set up another time-lapse near the thickest cluster of pipewort I could find and let it run for a good long time. Finally, we can see a small group of fish did take refuge among these plants, though I wasn't aware of this, so that's when I stopped the time-lapse. It wasn't until I got back home and reviewed all this footage days later that I realized I had succeeded in capturing at least some fish on camera, so I ended my first day of searching for the silver trout thinking I hadn't seen a single fish and felt no closer to solving any of the mysteries surrounding it. Though by this point I was certain of one thing. There was no great abundance of any kind of fish here in Dublin Pond, which may be a clue all on its own. So next I headed 120 miles north to Christine Lake, the only other known habitat of the silver trout. Drone footage of the lake revealed this corner here to be shallower than the rest, so that's where I initially focused my search. I again started with some good old-fashioned fishing, but quickly decided I'd have better luck getting into the water myself. Though unlike Dublin Pond, which was mostly flat and sandy, the lake bed here consisted of much larger rocks, meaning I didn't swim so much as I crawled over them. Looking down, you could see these rocks provide countless little crevices and cavities on the lake floor for animals to hide within, and before long I ran into my first school of fish. They allowed me to get real close, which made it easy to identify them as pumpkin seeds, one of the most common types of sunfish found within the lakes of this region, and easily recognizable thanks to their bright colors and characteristic black dot or pumpkin seed on their sides. These were by far the most numerous fish I saw on this trip, as my presence seemed to make them more curious than scared, and I'd often turn around to find a whole school of pumpkin seeds trying to pretend like they weren't just watching over me. The only other fish I saw with any frequency were smallmouth bass, which like to hang out in groups of pumpkin seeds, at least until I discovered them, at which point they became a lot more camera shy. Seriously, this happened on more than one occasion, where I'd be filming a school of pumpkin seeds only for a bass to suddenly appear, just to immediately flee once being detected. Besides that, there were a few other smaller fish I found hiding out between the rocks that I couldn't quite identify, though it was clear none were the elusive silver trout. So overall, after searching Christine Lake, all I had was way more footage of pumpkin seeds than I knew what to do with, and not much else. I'll admit by this point I was close to ending my search, as I had visited and collected footage from both environments, so this seemed good enough. But at the very end of the day, a local resident who I only accidentally managed to get footage of told me that the only place he'd ever caught any trout here was far out on the other side of the lake, by the inlet where the water from the surrounding mountains flows in. With this new piece of information, I had no choice but to return the next day to conduct one final search. And along the way, something incredible happened. Seemingly out of nowhere, my good friend and fellow YouTuber Milo from the channel Mini Minute Man appeared.
You guys got any silver trout?
Together, we paddled all the way up Christine Lake, and along the way, I asked Milo if he could help me solve any of the mysteries surrounding the silver trout. Fortunately, Milo just so happened to be working on a video of his own about the natural history of this area, so he knew perfectly well how this fish came to inhabit two different lakes 100 miles apart, and once we arrived on the shores of this inlet, he sat down to explain it to me.
To find the answer to this question, we can't look at the world as it is today. Instead, we have to look at the world as it was about 15,000 years ago. I want you to imagine back in time, we are now at the end of the last glacial maximum. About 20,000 years ago, the glaciers begin to recede and are pouring meltwater across the continent of North America. As this happens, huge lakes begin to form in the depressions left behind by the glacier. And one of these lakes formed right here in New England, and it was known as Glacial Lake Hitchcock. This lake, which is almost 300 miles long, filled the Connecticut River Valley with glacial meltwater. Because of this, the lake persisted long enough that there was a whole ecosystem that was able to form around it. And part of the watershed for Glacial Lake Hitchcock was right here at Christine Lake. Because of this, the ecosystem of Christine Lake, what was the other one called? Patrick's Pond? Yo, Kalen!
Yeah,
What's the name of the other pond with the silver trout?
Dublin Pond.
Dublin Pond, Patrick's Pond. Is that a little racist? The reason that Christine Lake and Dublin Pond both had the same trout species despite being 100 miles apart is because they were all part of the Glacial Lake Hitchcock ecosystem. But this lake disappeared practically overnight thanks to a catastrophic ice dam breach in Rocky Hill, Connecticut. And so the silver trout was effectively left behind as its ecosystem literally vanished. But there was a few places where the silver trout was able to hold on and establish a small foothold in the ponds that were left behind after the lake drained. And so small isolated populations were able to survive all the way until, colonization.
Okay, thanks Milo. If you'd like to know more about Glacial Lake Hitchcock, make sure to check out his video on it after this. But for now, let me see if I can put this into a biogeographic perspective real quick. Having just formed, this glacial lake environment was a pristine one, free of both competition and predators, almost as if it were a volcanic island newly risen from the sea. We call these sorts of freshly made environments de novo or new islands, and they present quite an exciting opportunity for whatever flora and fauna can find their way into them first. Evidently, a population of brook trout found its way into Lake Hitchcock, where it discovered a new world free from many evolutionary pressures, but also one with limited resources due to the barren nature of the immediately post-glacial landscape. Due to the scarcity of food here, over the next 4,000 years, smaller individuals in the trout population succeeded more frequently than larger, hungrier individuals, leading to an overall shrinking of the fish in this lake, producing a species half the size of their brook trout ancestors. Call it a case of insular dwarfism if you'd like, but for now we'll just say that's how evolution works. And the product of all this work was a genetically distinct trout population within the waters of Lake Hitchcock. However, there's still one problem with this explanation. Even at its greatest extent, Glacial Lake Hitchcock never quite rose high enough to encompass either Christine Lake or Dublin Pond. So how did the silver trout get from Lake Hitchcock into these other two bodies of water? To understand this, we need only study their closest living relative, the brook trout. These live most of their lives in large lakes before migrating up tributaries into secluded spawning grounds to reproduce. Knowing this, it's reasonable to suspect the silver trout to have done the same, each year migrating up the many tributaries feeding into Glacial Lake Hitchcock in search of a safe place to lay their eggs. Evidently, Christine Lake and Dublin Pond provided these safe spaces, and were likely visited by silver trout annually until eventually they established even smaller permanent populations in these waters as well. So, once the ice dam holding Glacial Lake Hitchcock finally burst and its waters drained, the silver trout's primary habitat went with it, leaving only those remnant populations tucked away in the surrounding mountains. That's how one unique fish species found its way into two distinct bodies of water. Lake Hitchcock was the missing piece that solves our first mystery. Thanks again to Milo for helping me out with that one. But this also lets us start figuring out our second mystery of what caused the silver trout to disappear. Knowing what we know now, we can see how by the time Europeans arrived thousands of years later, what they found in these lakes was not some robust, thriving animal, but rather a delicate relic from a bygone era, just barely managing to cling on to existence, and their reliance on just two small environments for their survival made them incredibly vulnerable to any and all changes brought on by European settlers. However, if you actually travel to these ponds like I did and take a look around, you won't find many obvious signs of environmental disturbance. There isn't any industrial sewage being poured in, there aren't fleets of fishermen exploiting these waters, and most of the surrounding area remains forested. Sure, maybe there are some roads, a couple houses, and a few power lines nearby, but nothing so destructive as to render these waters unviable. So what exactly did these colonists do that caused this fish to disappear? Well, to fully understand this, we need to go back to the very earliest written record we have of this trout. According to John Bank in his book About Trout, he writes how the first written account of the Monadnock silver trout appeared in 1850, when it was already mentioned that their abundance had declined from former times. This was likely because the local people of the area had long known that large numbers of silver trout would suddenly appear in shallow water for spawning each October, and they would be snagged and snared for human and hog food. In this 1914 manuscript, The Fishes of New England, Trout or Jar edition by William Converse Kendall, we'll read how so precise are they in their time of appearing that this fisherman has for the last 6 or 8 successive years taken 50 or 75 pounds on the first day of October. Let me say that again, just one fisherman could catch 75 pounds of silver trout in a single day. Further on, I read how the trout has been taken in this pond, as far as I could learn, from time immemorial, and formerly in so great numbers, to use the language of the old fishermen, as to have been fed by bushels to the hogs. This was later corroborated when Mr. Mason said that some 80 years ago, persons living on the lake used to send their boys out to catch a pailful for their hogs, which could be done in a very short time. He said that up to 30 years ago, he had seen cartloads on the spawning bed where trout were taken in large numbers and in good size. I even found a 1902 book titled Forest, Lake and River, The Fishes of New England and Eastern Canada, where it was written that the silver trout formerly swarmed in Dublin Pond to the extent that the farmers are said to have backed their wagons into the shallows and scooped in the fish with nets for manuring purposes. As we can see, people were not only overfishing the silver trout to feed themselves, but they were once so plentiful that people used them wastefully to feed livestock and fertilize fields. If that wasn't bad enough, Bank writes how in the 1870s and 80s, fishermen claimed that because the silver trout was not a brook trout, they were not protected under brook trout regulations in regard to season and bag limits. Here in this book, we'll read how by some it is claimed that they are lake trout and can be taken in the months of January, February, and March. Others say they are brook trout and cannot be taken in the closed season. So anxious are parties to take this fish that in the months of January, February, March, and April, they are, in their opinion, lake trout. As the close season begins then on lake trout, the same parties call them brook trout after April 30th to September 30th, open season for brook trout. This is quite an ingenious contrivance for the fishermen, but destructive to the fish. This loophole in the fishing law pretty much allowed fishermen to take as much of this critically endangered species as they pleased, and at the center of it was the question of what the silver trout actually was. In fact, this unregulated fishing frenzy got so bad that by 1885, an exceedingly interesting question has arisen in Dublin, New Hampshire in relation to the subject of fish protection. It appears that of late, persons have been catching a certain kind of trout from Dublin Pond and claiming that it is a peculiar species and is not protected by the state law. The local wardens refrained from making arrests under the circumstances, but caught some fish and forwarded them to the state commissioners. The samples taken after this incident are the very same ones that would eventually allow scientists to identify the silver trout as a distinct species, and so we can see how the overfishing of the silver trout is the reason why we even have record of it in the first place. So is that it then? We simply overfished them? Well, if we keep reading, we'll learn how eventually the commissioners have instructed the Dublin wardens to prohibit the catching of the fish under discussion and to prosecute all persons found taking them. So at least the silver trout was protected from fishing in the end. And considering these protections went into effect around the year 1885, and if you'll remember, it wasn't until the late 1930s that the fish truly disappeared, making it look like they may have helped prolong the fish's existence after all. But then this leaves the question, if overfishing alone wasn't enough to drive them extinct, then what was it that pushed them over the edge? Well, this is what I spent the rest of my time at Christine Lake trying to solve. While Milo was busy filming his bit on Lake Hitchcock, I immediately got to work searching for fish. Near the shores of the inlet, I found some more pumpkin seeds, but perhaps more surprising was that I started to find some actual vegetation, clusters of plants forming the sorts of complex environments fish just love hiding in. The fallen trees nearby also offered a refuge that ended up being by far the liveliest area I'd seen this whole trip, though I still hadn't spotted anything bigger than a smallmouth bass. So next I tried following the cold stream water as deep as I could. Quickly, the lake floor dropped away to a depth I could not swim to. While this made it real tiring to search, this was also where I finally started to have some luck. First, I got pretty close to this large fish, what was probably another kind of bass. Though I soon learned the bigger fish are, the less curious they tend to be, and this one got away before I could get a good shot of it. This would be the trend for the rest of the day, as the very action of turning the camera in their direction would trigger most fish to dart away, leaving me with a lot of footage like this. In the end, despite my best efforts, I failed to find anything truly of note within the waters of either Dublin Pond or Christine Lake, and if you ask me, what I did find swimming in these waters was a very average assortment of fish, pretty much exactly what you'd find in every other lake in New England. And that's the problem. You see, prior to the arrival of European settlers, each lake had amassed its own unique assortment of species based on their natural history. While this amount of diversity might have been impressive from a scientific perspective, in the eyes of the colonists now relying on these lakes for their survival, the smaller, more diverse populations simply weren't as productive as the kinds of fish being bred in captivity back in Europe. In an attempt to make these waters more reliable sources of food, many early settlers stocked these lakes by introducing the eggs of more farmable fish breeds. Here in Dublin Pond, at least 9 types of fish are known to have been added: Atlantic salmon, Chinook salmon, the rainbow smelt, the brown bullhead, rainbow trout, lake trout, brown trout, white perch, and yellow perch, all of which contributed to the silver trout's disappearance by altering the conditions of the environment. Specifically, all 3 of the introduced trout species occupied practically the same niche as the silver trout, forcing them into direct competition with one another for the limited resources the pond provided. Having spent the past few thousand years free from competition, the silver trout was simply no match against these robust species, causing the already overfished population to diminish even further. Though the final nail in the silver trout's coffin was likely the introduction of the yellow perch. These weren't competitors but rather predators, as they fed directly on the trout's vulnerable eggs. Again, having spent several millennia in isolation, it's likely the silver trout had lost any instinct to protect or even hide its eggs, making them easy prey for a trained egg poacher like the yellow perch. Together, humans introduced new forms of both competition and predation to this pond, quickly overcrowding this fragile ecosystem that had been preserved since the last ice age, replacing its peculiar species with the same assortment of fish being stocked in every body of water across the New World, resulting in what you see here, a lake full of nothing but pumpkin seeds. Altogether, it was a combination of overfishing, wasteful practices, and introduced species that led to the silver trout's demise, solving our second mystery. But this also leaves the door open for our third and final mystery. Could there still be a population of Salvelinus agassiae alive somewhere out there? And by extension, does it make sense for me to continue searching for the silver trout? Well, to my surprise, it turns out a lot of the people who studied it at the time thought the answer was yes. Perhaps the first person to ever describe the peculiar trout of Dublin Pond was the renowned American naturalist Louis Agassiz, the fish's taxonomic namesake, who predicted that it would be found elsewhere, for he did not believe nature made this beautiful fish for one little pond in New Hampshire. In this 1902 book on the fishes of New England, it says the silver trout is found in Dublin Pond and doubtless exists in other waters of the same state. Even John Bank concludes his piece on the silver trout by writing, based on the lessons of the return from extinction of the original Pyramid Lake and Alvord Basin cutthroat trout, there is always hope. As you can see, for as long as we've known about it, there's been the question of whether or not the silver trout is truly gone, or if it might be found in other lakes. And this makes sense. If the silver trout colonized these two lakes, it's entirely possible it could have done the same across any of the thousands of other lakes littering this landscape. But that's still nothing more than speculation mixed with some wishful thinking. However, what gave me even more hope came a little before this in Banks' book, where he writes the January 1939 issue of Outdoor Life contained a story entitled Warriors in Silver, with the intriguing heading, "As mysteriously as it had disappeared, a scrappy species of trout returns to a mountain lake." The story concerns catching silver trout in Monadnock Lake and has a photo of an angler holding 4 silver trout of about 2 to 3 pounds. Are they indeed S. agassiae? I cannot tell from the photo. This was incredibly exciting to read for 2 reasons. First, the thought that the silver trout was rediscovered once already means I might be able to do it again. And second, because in all my research, I haven't come across a single photo of this fish and still don't have a clear idea of what it looks like. So naturally, I hunted down a copy of this magazine on eBay. And if we flip it open, sure enough, we will find an article titled Warriors in Silver listed on page 18. Turning to this page, we'll find a lot to unpack, including several interesting photos, but let me start by reading you this small excerpt. I thought no more about silver trout until 5 years ago when Reg Howe called me on the phone. "Come on over," he said excitedly. "I've got something to show you that'll make your eyes look like toy balloons." Reg is an angler who isn't given to exaggeration, so I hustled over to his place without delay. There, set off by a bed of large green ferns, lay 4 of the most beautiful trout I had ever seen, their resplendent silver bodies far surpassing all the luster the old-timer had described to me. And then, if we look over here, we'll find the photograph taken from this encounter, where Reg holds up his 4 prize catches, the very photo Bank alluded to in his book. However, that's only the beginning of this story, as Reg's success inspired the author of this article, John E. Coffin, to set off on a quest of his own to catch a silver trout. That's who's in the rest of these photos. He writes how for the next 4 years, I numbed my hands and feet waiting for a silver-hued trout to come along. I made weekly or bi-weekly pilgrimages to the haven of dreamfish. To make a long story short, John E. Coffin did eventually catch a silver trout himself, as these images show. Here we can see him wrestling it out of the water from his boat. Here he's bringing it ashore, and then finally this is him holding it up to the camera. Now technically, none of these photos are good enough to actually allow us to confirm this really is a silver trout, but based on the testimony he gave, I'm willing to trust John E. Coffin on this one and consider these to be the only known photographs of this extinct fish. If so, that would actually be pretty significant, as this issue was published in 1939. But if you'll remember, the last truly confirmed sighting of the silver trout happened in 1930, so if all the information in this article is to be believed, silver trout were still being caught much later than this. Since this is the January 1939 issue, I'm going to assume John E. Coffin succeeded in his quest the year before this, meaning there were still silver trout here in 1938, just 1 year before the New Hampshire Fish and Game Department declared them extinct. But considering it took John 4 years of weekly fishing trips just to catch one, it's hard to trust this study was as conclusive as previously thought. After reading this story, I can't help but be filled with the sense that maybe, just maybe, it really is possible for this fish to have avoided detection, and the least I could do is try one more time. But before I do, I want to give myself the best chance possible. Fortunately, Bank makes mention of a W.C. Kendall who studied the silver trout, and the results of his study, including a color painting, are included in his monograph of New England chars published in 1914. This was really exciting to hear, as the only images I've seen so far have been black and white, and it would really make sense for me to know what these fish actually looked like. So I hunted down a copy of The Fishes of New England by William Converse Kendall, and this turned out to be a treasure trove of information. Inside, Kendall starts off with one of the very earliest accounts of the fish, written by Dr. Samuel L. Bigelow, published in the Boston Journal of Natural History all the way back in 1850. In this, Bigelow describes how the southwest shore is more stony and less exposed than almost any other, and here it is that the trout form their beds and come up to spawn. And wow, just like that, we now know the exact area I need to search, which is good because on my first visit, I stuck to the more accessible northern coast of the pond. But Bigelow continues, their beds, as they are called, are merely small cavities formed by the accidental position of 3 or 4 stones sunk to their upper surface in the sand. This is great because now I have 2 things to search for, silver trout and their beds, which are most numerous within 10 feet of the shore and in not more than 10 or 12 inches of water. This information narrows down my search area tremendously, but that's not all. As Bigelow writes, they remain in the deep water about the center of the pond during the entire year, except spawning season, which commences about the 1st of October. The spawning lasts, I think, 2 or 3 weeks, after which they return again to the deep water. This is super important because it means I only have a very brief window of time to see the silver trout each year. Though now that I know where and when to search, it's tempting to go charging back off to New Hampshire. But let's keep reading and see what other valuable information this might provide. Later on, Kendall includes a letter written by one of the fish wardens of the pond, who wrote how last fall I obtained permission from the state commissioners to take 50 of these fish for the purpose of stocking Stone Pond. I caught 2 distinct varieties of trout, one very light-colored, slim and silvery, the other, to all appearances, was a common brook trout. Besides providing us with a strong testimonial in favor of the silver trout being considered distinct from the brook trout, did you happen to notice the other interesting bit of information he shared? The fish warden caught those fish for the purpose of stocking Stone Pond, or in other words, he tried to start a new colony of silver trout. Did he succeed? I don't know, and in fact nobody knows, as this was the only mention of this ever happening. But considering Stone Pond is just a couple miles west of Dublin Pond, it wouldn't hurt to stop by and search it as well. Now I have not 1 but 2 places to search, but there's still one last thing I was hoping to find in here, a color painting, as promised by Bank. Flipping to the back, we'll find Plate 1, a male lake trout, Plate 2, a female lake trout, Plate 3 and 4 are blueback trout, Plate 5, white trout, and there it is, Plate 6, the silver trout. At first glance, it's hard to appreciate what really makes them special, as they kinda just look like any average fish, so perhaps it'd be more useful to learn how to differentiate silver trout from any regular brook trout that may appear. Fortunately, that's exactly what's on Plate 7. Putting these images side by side, we can see how brook trout have many more of these vermiculated spots along their backs, while silver trout have fewer, more organized spotting. They appear to have lighter green on their backs and whiter bellies, and let's not forget silver trout were only ever about half the size of brook trout. Even still, it's fair to say these two fish do look rather like one another, and it wouldn't be hard to confuse them in their native environment. But now that I know where to search, when to search, and what I'm searching for, I now feel ready to return to Dublin Pond and give this one last go. While I make the drive there, let's talk a little more about where I need to search. Bigelow said the southwest shores, but what does that actually mean? Did it mean from here to here, or anywhere in between? Because we have nothing more specific than southwest, I'm going to search all areas that can be described as either south or west. However, there does seem to be one obvious place to look, and that's right here, arguably the most southwestern corner of the whole pond. What's interesting about this spot is that today, this is exactly where you'll find the public boat launch, and I don't think this is a coincidence. Do you remember those stories of people backing wagons into the lake to haul away the fish? Well, my guess is that this is where people used to come to do that, as it gave them direct access to the spawning ground. If true, that would mean the waters directly surrounding this ramp are the prime location to find silver trout. Unfortunately, because of the loading ramp, this has also become the most highly trafficked part of the entire pond, and as such, the environment here has been highly disturbed. Still, I searched this area thoroughly, trying my best to stay 10 feet from shore and within a foot of water. Sure enough, here on this side of the pond, I found a much rockier lake bed, just like Bigelow had described. I took this as a good sign and spent about half the day searching this one small bay. Periodically, I'd stick my camera underwater with the hopes of catching any fish lurking deeper, but as you can see, this didn't really result in much, and instead reaffirmed how empty these waters are. This wasn't a visibility problem either, as the water in this pond is actually perfectly clear, or at least it was until I came through and disturbed the surface muck, causing the water to become cloudy. So, after a while, I started making my way further up the western shore. The further I went, the less impacted the environment seemed to be, and I started finding other kinds of vegetation I hadn't seen on the northern end. I'm not exactly sure what it was, but soon I started finding large groves of this vegetation covering the pond floor. Not only did this make the pond feel richer, but a closer look revealed countless little fish swimming among these plants. While these were probably just some kind of minnows, the sheer number of them hanging out in these shoals was impressive, and for the first time, Dublin Pond didn't feel so empty. But I was also aware that I was beginning to stray outside of my search area, so after reaching what I deemed no longer south, I turned back and started working my way around the rest of the southern bank, which was a much longer process with miles of shore to cover. Though the fact that I only had to search a few feet from the shore made it doable, even in the cold October waters. This took pretty much the entire rest of the day, though by the end of it, all I had was loads more footage of lifeless shores and empty waters. That's why when I returned the next day, I tried something different. By this point, it was apparent I wasn't going to find any fish just dawdling in the shallows, so I hopped in my kayak and headed out into the center of the pond where the water was deeper. Here, I tied my GoPro to some fishing line like this, threw it over the edge, and let it sink. My hope was that this would allow me to see parts of the lake that were otherwise too deep for me to access. While this did sort of work, again, most of the footage from this was not the best, as I had no control over how the camera moved. However, there were moments of success where I would catch brief glimpses of the lake bottom, though again, all this revealed was a rather barren landscape. Down here, the only animals to be seen were these mussels or clams sticking out from the lake floor. After seeing this, I paddled even further out and dropped my camera into the deepest part of the lake. I dropped it for what seemed like a lifetime, though as the footage shows, I never quite reached the bottom. I spent pretty much the entire second day repeating this experiment, watching my GoPro disappear into the hazy depths over and over again with no clue as to what I was seeing, simply hoping that on one of my drops I might get lucky and spot something interesting. After getting back home, I counted up all the files I'd gotten from this, starting with GH011053 and going all the way to GH011170, which means I ended up trying this 117 times in total, and to be honest, most of these failed to find anything. But finally, on file GH011093, so my 40th attempt, if you watch it all the way through, wait for it, there, did you see it? Down here we'll catch a brief glimpse of this guy. I had no way of knowing this at the time, so the camera quickly passed over him, but even from this short sighting, I could tell this fish was only about 6 to 8 inches, and definitely not a trout, probably just some kind of sunfish. The next clip of note was GH011162, or roughly 69 attempts later, where after some cruising you can just barely see this guy hanging out, and then over here, his buddy, though again neither of these look like trout. Hey everyone, it's me from much later to say that after rewatching this clip a few times, I noticed there are actually 2 more fish over here. In fact, I'll admit this happened more than once, like with file GH011088, where after watching the footage over, I noticed this guy swims across our view. I'm not sure how I missed this the first time around, but if we take a closer look, again we'll see this is probably just another sunfish. After this, reviewing GH011106 revealed this guy right before he swam for cover. Exciting, right? Well, if we continue watching this file, I pass over a rocky shoal before reaching its edge, where, bear with me for a moment, eventually we'll see 2 more fish. However, my biggest find came after re-examining file GH011101. On this drop, I tried to survey the part of the lake where the shore drops away to see if any fish like to hang out around the outskirts of the deep. After catching a whole lot of nothing that I won't force you to watch, finally through the murky water we can see this faint shape swimming over a rock, and not long after there's this one even further back. I know they're hard to see as they appear pretty far away, but the fact that we can see them at all from such a distance means these were rather large fish. If we continue watching, this guy swims out of frame, but this one back here swims in front of this rock, making him slightly easier to see. Only after this did I realize there's another fish down here too. Sadly, the camera drifted away from them, but right before it did, this fish turned around, giving us one good look at them before they're out of view. To be honest, this still kinda just looks like every other sunfish I've been seeing down here, but this was definitely the biggest group of them, both in numbers and size. After this, for some reason, the camera started to spin. Again, I had no control over this, though on its way back around, you can catch another glimpse of this school, where I think I can count 4 fish. While I guess technically this was more successful than day 1, I wouldn't know this until checking my camera hours later, and so as day 2 came to a close, I still couldn't say I'd seen anything that truly excited me. That is, until I'd already started paddling back to the loading ramp, when along the way, suddenly I saw something moving in the water. Unfortunately, I don't have footage from the beginning of this encounter, as my camera was literally at the bottom of the pond, so let me describe it for you. I look out over the pond to see a fin break above the surface, sorta like how a shark or a dolphin would, only much smaller. Immediately upon seeing this, I hauled up my camera and paddled over to investigate. Putting my camera back in the water, I was stunned to see by far the largest fish I'd come across over this entire project, roughly a foot, maybe a foot and a half long. However, this shot wasn't good enough to properly identify the fish, so I pulled my camera back out of the water and paddled even closer to it. In the moment, I couldn't help but be reminded of this passage from Bigelow's account. Having reached their beds, they lose almost entirely their natural cautiousness and shyness, and seemed wholly absorbed in the object of their visit. Once I'd gotten nearer, I stuck my camera back beneath the water and finally captured this fish up close. Just as Bigelow had described, it didn't seem bothered by my presence in the least, and allowed me to get right up beside it. Doing this, I got a good enough look at it to tell it was no ordinary kind of fish, but undoubtedly this was some kind of trout. And it's hard for me to express just how exciting this was. I'd spent the past months obsessing over the trout in this pond, only to go day after day finding nothing bigger than my pinky. So to finally see not just a big fish, but a bona fide trout in this pond was monumental for me. And my next order of business was to figure out exactly what kind of trout this was. Now, I'll admit I'm no expert, but it's plain to see that this isn't a brook trout, as those are much more colorful. Comparing this to the silver trout, sadly, it also isn't a very close match. But that still leaves the three other introduced trout species: lake, brown, and rainbow. In my opinion, lake trout aren't a close match either, as they're much darker with white spots, while this one was lighter with dark spots. Brown trout have a really distinct orange-yellow coloration that this clearly doesn't. That leaves only the rainbow trout, which, if you ask me, is the best fit for what I saw: a light gray body with dark spotting, as well as a faint pinkish stripe on its side. So that's what I'm going with. This here is a rainbow trout. While I was a bit disappointed this wasn't the exact trout I was looking for, I still can't tell you how happy I was to have seen it, as this confirms two things for us. First, that there are in fact trout in this pond, and second, that the trout here today are introduced species. And considering this happened at the very end of the day, I couldn't think of a better way to conclude my time here in Dublin Pond. However, that's not exactly the end of this story. Like I mentioned, this happened at the very end of day 2 of 3, and I saved my third and final day for exploring Stone Pond. Well, it turns out this whole area is a private neighborhood that I didn't technically have access to. This meant I had to be quick as I made my way around the pond. Along the way, I did observe a pleasant little pond ecosystem, featuring loads of these lily pads and other sorts of plants which were home to fish big and small. I even ended up seeing some eastern spotted newts. Overall, the amount of life I witnessed over this very brief period really made me wish I could have spent more time here, but I was too paranoid about my car getting towed to spend the full day on these waters, and so by about noon, I found myself returning to Dublin Pond one last time. Here, I hopped in my kayak and headed straight back to where this encounter had taken place the previous day, only to come upon a disturbing sight. Tangled within some nearby plants, I could see the pale glimmer of a fish's underbelly. Having spent the previous night studying all the different trout I might find in this pond, a closer inspection made this dead fish pretty easy to identify as another rainbow trout, for it too had this light green speckled back with a bright pink stripe on its side. Naturally, this raised the question of whether or not this was the very same fish I'd seen the day before. Initially, I thought the answer was no, as the coloration alone appeared different, but after getting back home and comparing the pattern of spotting on its tail fin, I'm afraid to say that now I believe this is the fish I saw the previous day. Although I was saddened by this, I didn't find it too surprising, as it was acting strange yesterday, swimming at the surface and all. Clearly, something was wrong with this trout before I ever even saw it. But what? I know this sounds crazy, but it really felt like the universe was trying to tell me something. Again, I couldn't help but be reminded of a passage by Bigelow. They were on the south side of the pond, whence the fish had gradually followed the shore till year before last, when they came up on the extreme southwest shore, where I found them. By the sounds of it, the southern shore was their original spawning grounds, which is exactly where I was when finding these trout. So I thought, why not try filming the lake bed here, just to see if there's anything interesting down there. Sure enough, after lowering my camera down, something did start to catch my eye. Not any fish, but rather the rocks on the lake floor. There were several spots like this, where 3 or 4 rocks came together to form an indentation in the ground, more or less fitting Bigelow's description of the silver trout's spawning beds. But what really caught my attention was the freshly cleared sand surrounding many of these rocks. This again reminded me of a passage I'd read. The trout, having selected these cavities, clean them out with great care, removing the finer particles of dirt by fanning with their tails and the larger with their mouths. Reading this, I couldn't help but feel like that's exactly what I was seeing here, as something was definitely clearing the sands around these rocks. It would appear these beds are still in use. While it might sound insane, Kindle included a statement saying as much here, where a person signing himself as the fish warden wrote that both kinds of trout spawned on the same beds, but that the brook trout were about 14 days later than the others. Further down, Mr. Robinson wrote that they gather on the same spawning bed at the same time as the other trout. So what we're seeing here is that even though the silver trout may be gone, the rocks they used to spawn on are still here and appear to still be in use, likely by both the native brook trout as well as the non-native species. And I'll be honest, coming to this realization left a strange feeling in me, as there's just something so ominous about seeing a very real and tangible space where an extinct animal once lived and reproduced. Knowing that these collections of rocks were the very same ones the silver trout once swarmed made this feel very real all of a sudden, as if I was looking at the ruins of someone's old home that had burned down. I don't know why, but going into this, I wasn't really expecting to find any spawning beds, but the more I think about it now, the more it makes sense that they'd still be here. They're just piles of rocks after all, that have likely been in the same exact spot for thousands of years. And if you ask me, so long as these beds appear in use, the case for the silver trout remains open. Though even after spending the rest of my time here surveying these beds, I didn't see any more fish, and by the end of my third and final day, this was still the most remarkable thing I'd seen, and in a weird way, this felt like a fitting conclusion to this adventure. I mean, technically, the whole purpose of my visit was in the hopes of witnessing a long-dead trout, so in some way, perhaps this was the universe giving me exactly what I'd wished for. Or maybe this was a lesson on the fragility of life, or something. I don't know, nature is hard to interpret sometimes. Either way, at the end of this day, I packed up for good and headed home to New York. Alright, I'm back and it's time to wrap things up. Let me start by talking about some of the problems I had with my search. First, by no means do I consider this to be a conclusive or even extensive effort. In fact, my greatest regret both times I visited was simply feeling like I didn't get to explore enough of this pond. Truth be told, there are limitations on the amount of time and money I can dedicate to a project, and in a perfect world, I would have spent the entire month of October searching these waters every day. But that brings me to the second problem with my search, the time of year I was there, October 2nd to 5th. I know this is the time Bigelow told me to come, but further on in this report we'll read how they started appearing later and later, with people finding them October 20th to 29th. Throw in 100 years of climate change since these reports, and who knows what time of the year silver trout would be rising from the depths now. There's also the problem that I only visited this pond during the daytime. Given that's when most people like to go fishing, it's possible any remaining silver trout survived by only coming out at night. While again this might sound like speculation, Bigelow said as much in his writings, where I was in the habit of disturbing them daily from sunrise till dark, and prevented them to a great extent from remaining quiet long enough to spawn, so they were compelled to come up in the night in order to go through with their labor undisturbed. So, if you ask me, it's possible that even if there are silver trout remaining here, I could still have zero chance of seeing them just because of what time of day I was out looking for them. There's also the problem that I didn't even return to Christine Lake, a seemingly more promising site, though if you're curious why, I can explain. You see, I'm pretty sure this William Converse Kendall guy is actually the one who found silver trout in Christine Lake, or at least that's what John Quackenboss wrote. Since this paper was written, Dr. Kindle has discovered in Christine Lake a beautiful fish form intermediate between the Dublin pond trout and the brook trout, thus undeniably confirming the author's theory of evolution. The Kindle fish represents a more advanced degree of the differential step towards the Fontinalis, nearer to it than any other divergent form. The Dublin pond char is a late divergent, but the new species is still more recent. From this description, it sounds like what was found in Christine Lake was related to the silver trout, but also distinct from it. However, in his own writings, Kindle only mentions Christine Lake on the very last page dedicated to the silver trout, where he lists it as a Salvelinus agassiae variety, indicating he thought this was a subspecies of the silver trout. What's even more strange is that most of what's written in here are not the words of Kindle, but rather Tarleton H. Bean, who examined the trout recently received from Christine Lake, New Hampshire, and had this to say about it. The proportions and other specific characters are the same as in the Monadnock Lake trout recently reported on, but the coloration is different. The ground color of the sides and upper parts is a rich purple. The sides are profusely ornamented with crimson spots, and the pectorals, ventricles, and caudal even now are largely suffused with vermilion. Another peculiarity of this trout is their elegant shape. The only opinion Kendall himself gives on this fish are the very last words of this section, where he writes how Dr. Bean's description and the foregoing information sufficiently indicates that the original trout of Christine Lake is or was distinct from Salvelinus fontinalis, aka the brook trout. It is therefore provisionally included here as a variety of S. agassiae, although an examination of specimens might reveal that it is entitled to a specific name. So if you ask me, it sounds like Christine Lake was once home to its own special breed of trout that may have only been related to the silver trout. And this feels like a good time to point out that Lake Hitchcock existed for only 4,000 years at most and disappeared over 12,000 years ago. That means even if both of these populations started out as silver trout, they then had 3 times the amount of time it took for them to evolve to continue evolving apart from one another. Knowing this, it's not only possible but probable that there was some degree of genetic drift between these two isolated populations. Whether that resulted in 2 different species, I really can't say. But because of this confusion, I decided to focus all of my efforts on the pond where this story is centered. Though I don't want you to think there's nothing worth searching for in Christine Lake, as this also means there could be something even more special swimming in these waters, an undescribed species. But because my mission was to find the silver trout, I stuck to Dublin Pond. This is all to say there were definitely some shortcomings with my search, as I'm only one person with a very limited set of skills, and if anyone watching thinks they can do a better job, then feel free to come here and search yourself. In fact, that's actually kind of my hope in bringing all this information to you. Now that you too know exactly where and when to find this fish, more people than ever can take part in the search for the silver trout, which is good because prior to making this video, it had been nearly 100 years since anyone seriously looked for this fish, and it was well on its way to being completely forgotten. But I believe that by coming out here, documenting these lakes, and telling the story behind this peculiar fish, I can keep the memory of the silver trout alive for just a little longer. I don't claim to be an expert fisherman or deep sea diver. I'm literally just some guy with a GoPro, and I'm sure at least some of you watching are capable of conducting much more extensive searches. So although I had to call it quits on this mission, my hope is that some of you will continue it for me. However, I can't help but feel like since I've dived deeper into the story of the silver trout than anyone else in the past 100 years, I now have a unique perspective on it that I'm sure many of you are curious about. Do I think the silver trout could still be out there, or did my observations convince me of its extinction? Well, let me start by addressing this first possibility, that the silver trout might exist somewhere besides Dublin Pond in the thousands of other lakes in Hitchcock's drainage basin. While I agree this is possible, here's the thing. All of these ponds were also stocked with the same assortment of fish as Dublin Pond. Every single one of these environments saw the introduction of new competitors and predators. And as such, even if the silver trout lived elsewhere, it's more than likely that they also suffered the same ecological collapse. However, the longer I had to sit and think about this experience, the more I started to formulate one final idea. You see, after ending my search on such a morbid note, I just couldn't get the memory of this fish out of my head. The fact that it was dead meant I got a good look at its underside, where I noticed there were a handful of particularly shiny scales. These didn't really come out well on camera as they sort of just look overexposed, but trust me, in person they really did glimmer in an amazing way, and I couldn't help but recall John E. Coffin's words. Resplendent silver bodies far surpassing all the luster the old-timer had described. Now call me crazy, but I couldn't help but think that a few of the scales here on the underside of this rainbow trout appeared silvery. And this made me real curious about fish sex. Looking it up, different trout species can and do commonly breed with one another and can even produce fertile offspring. If the silver trout was able to do the same, then it's possible that when other trout were introduced and began using the same exact rocks as spawning beds, some degree of crossbreeding took place between competing species. As more and more of the silver trout's offspring became mixed with other trout, there likely came a point where no purebred silver trout were successfully reproducing with any other purebred member of the same species, and thus no new purebred silver trout were being born, even though plenty of silver trout hybrids now swam in these waters. Again, these are just my thoughts on the matter, but the reason I liked this explanation so much and found it worth mentioning is because it accounts for the unaccountables. In learning stories of extinction like this, I always find myself asking questions like, surely us humans could not have caught every last silver trout in this lake, right? Like there must have been some that escaped our hooks and nets. But this idea that even those that did dodge our attacks still had no choice but to share these few spawning grounds with 4 other species and may have bred with the other trout until no more purebred silver trout remained explains this. The more I think about it, the more I realize it's actually just sorta inevitable that this would have happened, as Dublin Pond is one small isolated body of water that's completely spring-fed, meaning no other fish enter or exit, so the fish population that exists here today to some degree must be related to those that were once here. In this way, the silver trout may not have been driven extinct, but rather became absorbed as a piece of a new population, and may still survive, at least in part, in the fish that remain in this pond today. If so, then the only proper way to search for the silver trout would be to catch and analyze the DNA of this modern population to see if any long-lost relation still exists. So again, if any of you are aspiring ichthyology PhD candidates looking for a good research project, consider analyzing the fish of this pond and make sure to let me know what you find. Besides that, well, I don't really know what else to say. Is this project complete? Am I done with this? Well, that's the funny thing about seeking out extinct animals. Because the subject of my search is inherently impossible to actually find, there's never a place when you know to stop. At some point, you just gotta call it. So that's what I'm doing, for now. Trust me, it was really hard for me to just give up at a certain point, and I already want to go back and try out some more strategies. But well, as of yesterday, October 15th, the fishing season is officially closed, so the soonest I can return is next year, and I think that might be the best part about searching for extinct animals. Once started, this quest is never truly over, and despite having found very little in the way of tangible evidence, now more than ever I feel inspired to return to this lake and others in the area to continue exploring. To me, the silver trout is not only a perfect example of how even the most ordinary of places can still be home to something extraordinary, but also the perfect excuse to go outside, explore this world, and make some friends along the way.
I don't know how long I sat there, reflecting on the way of a trout. I thought of the thousands of eggs this trout might yet spawn, and the great fish like herself that would be her offspring. It occurred to me that all of its enemies except one must destroy the trout to live. Only man has an alternative. And I let her slip away back to her pool.